The gunshot that shattered the morning silence wasn't meant for her. But Eliza Dawson dropped to the dusty Arizona ground anyway, her heart hammering against her ribs as the echo rolled across the vast expanse of desert scrubland. She had been so careful, so quiet, slipping through the fence line just as dawn painted the sky in shades of copper and gold. But now someone knew she was here, trespassing on land that didn't belong to her. "Stand up slow and keep your hands where I can see them," a deep voice commanded from somewhere behind her, rough as gravel but controlled, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed without question. Eliza's mind raced through her options, none of them good. She could run, but she was already exhausted from 2 days of walking with barely any food or water. She could lie, but the truth was written all over her dusty, travel-worn dress and the desperation in her eyes. So she did the only thing she could do. She stood slowly, raising her hands above her head, and turned to face whatever judgment awaited her. The man who held the rifle wasn't what she expected. Most ranch owners she'd encountered in her 21 years were either grizzled old men with tobacco-stained teeth or soft-handed city folks playing at being cowboys. This man was neither. He couldn't have been more than 26 or 27, tall and lean with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than posturing. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, curling slightly at the ends beneath a worn hat, and his eyes were an unexpected shade of green that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed defenses. "This is private property," he said, lowering the rifle slightly but not completely. "You lost." "No," Eliza answered honestly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I knew exactly where I was. I just hoped I could get through before anyone noticed." Something flickered in those green eyes, surprise maybe at her directness. Most people would have scrambled to make excuses, but Eliza had learned the hard way that sometimes the truth, or at least a version of it, worked better than any lie. "Get through to where?" he asked, studying her more carefully now, taking in the torn hem of her dress, the blisters visible on her hands, the canvas bag she carried that looked nearly empty. "Eager," she said. "The town. I heard there might be work there." "Eager's 15 miles in the opposite direction," he pointed out, his tone suggesting he knew she was lying or at least not telling him everything. "Then I got turned around," Eliza said, meeting his gaze despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "It happens when you've been walking for days." He studied her for a long moment, and she studied him right back, noting the way his shirt was clean despite the early hour, the way his boots were well-made but worn from use, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work. This was a man who took care of what was his, which made her trespassing all the more serious. "What's your name?" he finally asked, shouldering the rifle in a gesture that suggested he'd decided she wasn't a threat, at least not the kind that required shooting. "Eliza Dawson." "I'm Dalton Quinn. This land has been in my family since 1867. That makes it mine now, and that makes you trespassing on what I've spent the last 5 years of my life trying to keep." His voice wasn't angry exactly, but there was a weariness to it that spoke of struggles she couldn't begin to guess at. It was 1885. And Arizona territory was still wild enough that property disputes could turn deadly, that water rights could start wars between neighbors, that a single bad season could ruin a man. Eliza understood that desperation, had lived it herself for the past 3 months since her father died and left her with nothing but debts and the clothes on her back. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "I'll go. I just need to know which direction." But as she spoke, the world tilted suddenly, and she realized with distant alarm that her legs were giving out beneath her. She'd pushed herself too hard, gone too long without proper food or rest, and now her body was demanding payment for that recklessness. Strong hands caught her before she hit the ground, and she found herself looking up into Dalton Quinn's face, seeing concern there that seemed at odds with the rifle he'd been pointing at her moments before. "When did you last eat?" he demanded, and the question carried more weight than it should have. "Yesterday morning," she admitted, though even that had been only a few berries she'd found growing wild. He muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse or a prayer, then scooped her up as though she weighed nothing at all. "House is a mile from here. You can eat there, rest, then we'll figure out what to do with you." "You don't have to," Eliza protested weakly, though even as she said it, she knew she was in no position to refuse his help. "No, I don't," Dalton agreed, his stride long and purposeful as he carried her across the scrubland. "But my mama raised me better than to let someone collapse from hunger on my property, trespasser or not." The walk to the house gave Eliza time to study the land around them. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, all red rock and tough desert plants that knew how to survive where nothing else could. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing, their brands too far away to make out clearly. Closer in, she saw the evidence of careful water management, irrigation ditches that had been dug by hand, cisterns positioned to catch every precious drop of rain. The house itself was larger than she expected, built of adobe with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and a roof of red clay tiles. It spoke of prosperity, or at least comfort, which made her wonder why a man like Dalton Quinn was out checking his fence lines personally at dawn instead of sending hired hands. He pushed through the front door with his boot and carried her inside, setting her down gently on a chair in the kitchen. The room was clean but clearly belonged to a man living alone. There were no curtains on the windows, no decorative touches, just the practical necessities of cooking and eating. "Stay here," Dalton ordered, already moving to the stove where he began building up the fire. "I'll make coffee and eggs." Eliza watched him work, noting the competence in his movements, the way he seemed comfortable in this domestic space despite his rough exterior. It didn't match the image she'd built in her head of ranch owners, the ones who left all the household work to wives or servants or simply did without. "Do you live here alone?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too personal, too forward, and she was in no position to be asking anything at all. But Dalton didn't seem offended. "For the past 2 years, yes. My father died in 1883, and there's just been me since then trying to keep this place running." "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly. "I lost my father 3 months ago. I know how hard it is." He glanced at her over his shoulder, and something in his expression shifted, as though he was seeing her as a person rather than just a problem to be solved. "Is that why you're wandering Arizona territory with nothing but the dress on your back?" "More or less," she admitted. "He had debts I didn't know about. They took everything, even the house. I thought maybe I could find work somewhere, start over." "Why eager?" Dalton asked, cracking eggs into a pan with practiced ease. "No particular reason." "I heard the name from another traveler, figured any town was as good as another." He nodded slowly, seeming to accept this. "What kind of work do you do?" "Whatever needs doing," Eliza said. "I can cook, clean, so help with animals. My father ran a general store in New Mexico before he got sick. I kept the books, dealt with suppliers, managed inventory. I'm not afraid of hard work." Dalton slid a plate of eggs and some bread in front of her, then poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "Eat slowly or you'll make yourself sick." It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, forcing herself to take small bites when her body screamed for her to devour everything in front of her. But she managed it, and with each bite, she felt a little more human, a little less like a desperate creature running on nothing but fear and determination. Dalton sat across from her with his own plate, eating in silence and watching her with those disconcerting green eyes. Finally, when she'd cleaned her plate and was working on her second cup of coffee, he spoke. "I have a proposition for you." Eliza tensed, every instinct she'd developed over the past 3 months going on high alert. She'd heard propositions before, from men who thought a desperate woman alone would be grateful for any kind of protection, no matter what it cost her. Dalton must have seen something in her face because he held up a hand. "Nothing improper, Miss Dawson. I need help here. The kind of help that involves cooking and cleaning and managing a household, not sharing a bed." "Why me?" she asked, still wary. "You could hire anyone, someone from town with references, a known reputation." "Because everyone in town comes with baggage," Dalton said bluntly. "Families who think their daughter working here means I should be courting her. Women who see this ranch as an opportunity rather than a job. You don't know anyone here. You don't have any expectations beyond honest work for honest pay. That's worth more to me than all the references in the world." It made a strange kind of sense, though Eliza still felt the need to ask. "What would people say about me living here, working for you? Won't that cause talk?" "This is my land," Dalton said with quiet intensity. "I don't care much what people say about what happens on it, long as I know the truth. But if you're worried about your reputation, there's a room above the barn that belonged to my foreman before he moved on. You'd have your own space, your own door that locks. I'd pay you fair wages, $30 a month plus room and board." $30 was more than generous for household work, enough that Eliza's suspicion flared again. "Why so much?" "Because I need someone reliable, and I need them to stay," Dalton said. "Last 3 people I hired left within a month. One because the isolation got to her, one because she thought she could change my mind about courting, and one because her family didn't approve of her working for an unmarried man. $30 is what it costs to find someone willing to stick it out." Eliza considered this, weighing her options. She could refuse, walk away, try to make it to Eager on her own. But she was exhausted and nearly broke, and there was no guarantee she'd find anything better in town. At least here she'd have food and shelter and honest work. At least here she knew exactly what was expected of her. "All right," she said finally. "I'll try it for a month. If it doesn't work out for either of us, I'll move on with no hard feelings." Something like relief crossed Dalton's face, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Fair enough. Let me show you the room, then you can rest today. Work starts tomorrow." The room above the barn was small but clean, with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the ranch. It had its own entrance via an external staircase, just as Dalton had promised, and the door had a sturdy lock. It wasn't much, but it was more than Eliza had had in months, and she felt something in her chest loosen at the sight of it. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than she could express. Dalton nodded, already turning to leave. "Rest today. I'll bring dinner up later. Tomorrow I'll show you the house and what needs doing." He was gone before she could respond, his boots heavy on the wooden stairs. Eliza stood in the middle of her new room, feeling the strangeness of the moment. This morning she'd been a trespasser, certain she'd be arrested or worse. Now she had a job, a room, and the promise of a fresh start. She should have been relieved, grateful, happy even. Instead, she felt unsettled in a way she couldn't quite name, as though by accepting Dalton Quinn's help, she'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. But she was too tired to analyze it further. She lay down on the bed, still wearing her dusty dress, and fell asleep to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the warm Arizona sun streaming through her window. When Eliza woke, the sun was setting, painting her room in shades of orange and red. There was a tray by the door with dinner on it, beef stew and more bread and a jar of cool water. Dalton must have brought it while she slept, quiet enough not to wake her. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, then used the water to wash the worst of the trail dust from her face and hands. She had one other dress in her bag, only slightly less worn than the one she was wearing, and she changed into it, trying to make herself presentable for her first real day of work tomorrow. As night fell, she stood by her window and looked out over the ranch. In the distance, she could see lights from the main house, warm and welcoming against the darkness. Closer by, she heard horses moving in the barn below, the soft sounds of animals settling for the night. It was peaceful in a way that Eliza hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. Even before her father died, there had always been worry, always some crisis lurking just around the corner. Here, in this moment, she felt something that might have been safety, fragile as it was. She went to bed properly this time, stripping down to her underclothes and slipping between sheets that were rough but clean. Sleep came easier than she expected, and if she dreamed, she didn't remember it. The next morning, Dalton knocked on her door just after dawn. When she answered, dressed and ready despite the early hour, he looked almost surprised. "Thought I might have to wake you," he admitted. "I'm used to early mornings," Eliza said. "My father's store opened at sunrise." He nodded, then gestured for her to follow him. "Come on. I'll show you the house." The main house was even larger than it had seemed yesterday, with a parlor that was clearly never used, 3 bedrooms, and a kitchen that was the clear center of Dalton's life. That was where he took her first, showing her where everything was kept, explaining his preferences in a way that was surprisingly detailed. "I'm not picky," he said, "but I don't like waste. Use what we have. Cook what makes sense for the season. We've got chickens for eggs, a vegetable garden that needs tending, and I usually butcher a steer every few months for meat. Anything else you need, make a list, and we'll go to town for supplies." "How often do you go to town?" Eliza asked, already making mental notes about the kitchen's organization. "Once a month usually, unless something urgent comes up. Next trip is in 2 weeks. He showed her the rest of the house, the bedrooms that were clearly never used, the parlor with its furniture covered in sheets. His own room was at the end of the hall, and he only opened the door long enough for her to see inside. It was as Spartan as the rest of the house, just a bed and a dresser and nothing that spoke of personality or comfort. "I spend most of my time outside," Dalton explained, as though reading her thoughts. "The house is just where I sleep and eat." "What about in winter?" Eliza asked, thinking of the Arizona winters she'd experienced, cold in a way that surprised people who expected endless desert heat. "I stay in more then," he admitted. "But I still have work to do. Animals don't stop needing care just because it's cold." He showed her the chicken coop next, where a dozen hens pecked contentedly in the morning sun. Then the vegetable garden, which was struggling despite the irrigation system Dalton had clearly worked hard to build. Eliza could see the problems immediately: plants too close together competing for resources, others in the wrong kind of soil for what they needed. "I'm not much of a gardener," Dalton admitted, seeing her expression. "I keep them alive, but barely." "I can help with this," Eliza said, already mentally reorganizing the space. "My mother used to keep a garden. I remember how she did it." Something crossed Dalton's face at the mention of her mother, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he said, "Do what you think is best. I'll trust your judgment." Those words, simple as they were, struck something deep in Eliza. When was the last time anyone had trusted her judgment? Her father had loved her but never quite believed she could handle anything important. The men she'd encountered after his death had assumed she was helpless, in need of rescue or exploitation depending on their nature. But Dalton Quinn looked at her and saw someone capable, someone worth trusting. She felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun beating down on them. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of information as Dalton showed her the full scope of the ranch. It was larger than she'd realized. Several hundred acres of grazing land with water rights that Dalton explained were more valuable than gold in this territory. He ran about 200 head of cattle, selling to buyers who came through from California and Texas, and he did most of the work himself with only occasional help from day laborers during roundup season. "It's a lot for one person," Eliza observed, seeing the strain in the lines around his eyes, the weariness he tried to hide. "It is," Dalton agreed, "but it's mine and I'm not willing to give it up. My father spent his whole life building this place from nothing. I won't be the one who lets it fall apart." There was a fierceness in his voice that spoke of determination but also of loneliness, of the weight of carrying something too heavy alone. Eliza understood that feeling better than she could say. They returned to the house for lunch, and Eliza made simple sandwiches from the bread and leftover beef. Dalton ate with the focused efficiency of someone who saw meals as fuel rather than pleasure, but he paused halfway through to say, "This is good. Better than what I usually make for myself." "It's just sandwiches," Eliza said, but she felt pleased anyway. "It's a meal someone else prepared," Dalton corrected. "That makes it better." After lunch, he headed back out to work and Eliza began her own tasks. She started in the kitchen, cleaning thoroughly and reorganizing with an eye toward efficiency. Then she moved through the rest of the house, opening windows to air out rooms that had been closed too long, removing dust covers from furniture that deserved to see the light. The work was satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. Each task completed felt like a small victory, a way of imposing order on chaos. And the house responded to her care, seeming to come alive in a way it hadn't been when she first arrived. Evening came, and Eliza prepared dinner, using what she found in the kitchen to make stew and biscuits. She wasn't sure if Dalton would expect her to serve him and leave or to eat with him, so she set 2 places at the table and waited to see what he'd do. He came in just as the sun was setting, dusty and tired but moving with the steady energy of someone used to long days of hard work. He washed up at the basin by the door, then stopped when he saw the table set for 2. "You don't have to eat separately if you don't want to," he said, seeming almost embarrassed. "I'm not formal about meals." "I wasn't sure what you'd prefer," Eliza admitted. "This is fine," Dalton said, sitting down. "Better than eating alone if I'm honest." They ate together, and in the silence that followed, Eliza found herself studying him again. He had a good face, she decided, strong and honest with lines that spoke of squinting into the sun and smiling more than she'd seen him do. There was a scar along his jaw that she hadn't noticed before, thin and white with age. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, breaking the comfortable quiet. "Depends on the question," Dalton replied, but his tone was mild. "Why did you really hire me?" "Not the reasons you said yesterday, but the real reason." He was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, waiting for an answer. "Because you were honest," he said finally. "When I caught you trespassing, you could have lied, made up some story about being lost. But you told me the truth, or enough of it. That's rare, especially out here where everyone's running from something or hiding who they really are. I figured if you were honest about that, you'd be honest about other things too. And I need someone I can trust." It was more than Eliza had expected, more vulnerable than she'd thought him capable of being. She felt that warmth in her chest again, stronger this time, mixed with something else she didn't want to examine too closely. "I'll do my best to earn that trust," she said quietly. "I know you will," Dalton replied, and the certainty in his voice made her believe it too. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and comfortable. Eliza rose early, prepared breakfast, then spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house. Afternoons were for the garden and the chickens and preparing dinner. Evenings they ate together, conversation sparse but companionable, before Dalton headed back out to finish his evening chores and Eliza retreated to her room above the barn. It was a simple life, structured and predictable in a way that should have been boring. But Eliza found herself settling into it with a contentment she hadn't expected. There was satisfaction in seeing the house transform under her care, in watching the garden begin to thrive with proper attention, in preparing meals that Dalton ate with genuine appreciation. And there was Dalton himself, who surprised her more with each passing day. He was quiet but not cold, reserved but capable of dry humor that caught her off guard. He treated her with respect that seemed as natural as breathing, never overstepping the boundaries they'd established, but also never making her feel like just an employee. 2 weeks into her employment, they made the trip to town for supplies. Eliza had been nervous about it, worried about what people might say or think, but Dalton seemed completely unconcerned. Eager was small, just a main street with a handful of businesses and houses clustered around them. The general store was the largest building, and Dalton pulled the wagon up in front of it with practiced ease. "Make your list," he said, handing her a piece of paper and a pencil. "Get whatever you need for the house." Inside, the store was crowded with goods of every description. The owner, a middle-aged man with a sharp eye and a sharper tongue, looked up as they entered. "Dalton Quinn," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy, George," Dalton replied easily. "This is Miss Eliza Dawson. She's managing my household now." George's eyes shifted to Eliza, assessing her in a way that made her skin prickle. "That's so. Last I heard, you were managing on your own." "Things change," Dalton said, his voice taking on an edge that suggested the conversation was over, but George wasn't ready to let it go. "Folks might wonder about a young woman living out at your place, no chaperone or nothing." "Then folks can wonder," Dalton said flatly. "Miss Dawson has her own quarters above the barn and my business is my own. Now, are you going to fill our order or do I need to take my money elsewhere?" George backed down quickly, the mention of money more persuasive than any argument. He took Eliza's list and began gathering items while Dalton stood beside her, a solid presence that felt protective without being possessive. When they'd loaded the wagon and were heading back to the ranch, Eliza said, "Thank you for that, for standing up for me." "I meant what I said," Dalton replied. "What happens on my land is my business. People can talk all they want, won't change anything." But Eliza knew it wasn't that simple. She'd seen the way some of the women in town had looked at her, a mixture of curiosity and judgment that spoke of future trouble. She told herself it didn't matter, that she was only here temporarily, that whatever gossip emerged wouldn't touch her. Still, the encounter had unsettled her, reminding her of how precarious her position really was. She was entirely dependent on Dalton's goodwill, his protection, his willingness to ignore social conventions for the sake of practicality. If he changed his mind, if he decided the gossip was too much trouble, she'd be right back where she started, alone and desperate. That night, she lay awake in her room, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. She'd been here 2 weeks, and already it felt more like home than anywhere she'd been since her father died. That was dangerous, she knew, because homes could be taken away and people could leave, and nothing in life was permanent no matter how much you wished it could be. But when morning came and she walked down to the main house to find Dalton already up and making coffee, when he smiled at her in that small, quiet way of his and said, "Morning, Eliza," she felt that warmth in her chest again, and knew it was already too late to guard her heart the way she should. The work continued, days bleeding into weeks until Eliza had been at the ranch for over a month. The house gleamed with her care, the garden flourished, and the meals she prepared grew more adventurous as she learned what Dalton liked and what the local ingredients could produce. But it was more than just the work. She and Dalton had fallen into an easy companionship that felt both natural and terrifying. They talked during meals about everything and nothing, his childhood growing up on this ranch, her memories of helping her father in the store, the small observations about life that people only shared when they felt safe. He made her laugh, which surprised her. His humor was dry and unexpected, catching her off guard in the best way. And she must have done something similar for him because she saw him smile more often, saw the tension in his shoulders ease when she was near. It was dangerous, this growing closeness. Eliza reminded herself daily that she was his employee, nothing more. That there was a line they couldn't cross without risking everything she'd built here. But her heart didn't seem to care about logic or propriety or the very real consequences of catching feelings for her employer. One evening in early October, Dalton came in later than usual, his face drawn with exhaustion. Eliza had kept dinner warm, and she served it without comment, recognizing that he needed food more than conversation. But when he'd finished eating, he sat back in his chair and said, "I need to tell you something." Eliza's stomach dropped. This was it, she thought. He was going to tell her that the arrangement wasn't working, that the gossip had gotten too bad, that she needed to leave. She braced herself for it, trying to keep her face neutral even as her heart raced. "I've been doing some thinking," Dalton continued, his green eyes fixed on hers. "About this place, about what I want for the future. And I've realized that I can't keep doing everything alone. I need help, real help, not just with the house but with the whole operation." "I don't know much about ranching," Eliza said carefully, not sure where this was going. "You're smart and you learn fast," Dalton countered. "I've watched you figure out the garden, manage the household accounts, solve problems I didn't even know I had. I think you could learn the ranching side too if you wanted to." "Why are you telling me this?" Eliza asked, her heart still racing but for different reasons now. Dalton leaned forward, his expression intense. "Because I'm asking you to stay, not just as someone who works here but as a partner in this place. I can't pay you what you deserve for that kind of responsibility, not yet, but I could offer you a percentage of the profits. Make you a real part of this ranch instead of just an employee." Eliza stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. It was more than she dared to hope for, an offer of real stability, of building something instead of just surviving day to day. But there was something in his eyes, some emotion she couldn't quite read that made her hesitate. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Anything." "Why me, really? Not because I'm honest or a good worker or any of the practical reasons. Why do you want me to stay?" Dalton was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, something shifted between them, some invisible line being approached that would change everything if they crossed it. "Because I don't want to imagine this place without you anymore," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion Eliza didn't dare name. "Because the house feels like a home again when you're in it. Because I wake up every morning looking forward to breakfast just so I can see you across the table. Because somewhere in the past month, you stopped being my employee and became something else, something more important than I know how to say." Eliza couldn't breathe. She'd suspected, hoped maybe in her most secret thoughts, but hearing him say it out loud was overwhelming in a way nothing in her life had prepared her for. "Dalton," she whispered, and there was everything in his name, all the feelings she'd been trying to deny, all the longing she'd been afraid to acknowledge. He stood, came around the table, and knelt beside her chair so they were at eye level. "I know this isn't what we agreed to. I know you came here for work, not for whatever this is between us. And if you want to pretend I never said anything, if you want to keep things as they are, I'll respect that. But I couldn't ask you to stay, to commit to this place, without being honest about how I feel." "And how do you feel?" Eliza asked, needing to hear him say it clearly. No room for misunderstanding. "I'm falling in love with you," Dalton said simply. "Maybe I've been falling since the moment I caught you trespassing on my property, and you looked at me with those defiant eyes and told me the truth. I don't know when it happened exactly. I just know that you matter to me in a way no one else ever has." Eliza reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin. "I'm falling in love with you too," she admitted. "I've been trying not to, telling myself all the reasons it was a bad idea. But I can't help it. You're good and kind, and you've given me more than shelter and work. You've given me a place to belong." Dalton turned his head, pressing a kiss to her palm, and the gesture was so tender, so full of reverence that Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes. "Then stay," he said. "Not as my employee or even as my partner in the ranch, though I want that too. Stay as the woman I love, the woman I want to build a life with." "That's a lot to promise," Eliza said, even as everything in her screamed to say yes immediately. "We've only known each other a month." "I know," Dalton agreed. "And I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow or make any promises you're not ready for. I'm just asking you to give us a chance, to see where this goes without pretending it's just a business arrangement." It was reasonable, more than reasonable considering how fast everything was moving. But Eliza looked into his green eyes and saw her future there, saw a life built on honesty and hard work and the kind of love that grew from genuine partnership rather than desperate need. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I want to see where this goes. Yes to all of it." Dalton's smile was like sunrise, transforming his whole face with a joy that took her breath away. He stood, pulling her up with him, and then his arms were around her, and she was being held like she was precious, like she was everything. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, feeling the rightness of it settling into their bones. Then Dalton pulled back just enough to look at her. "I'm going to kiss you now," he said, giving her time to object, to pull away. But Eliza just smiled and said, "I was hoping you would." His lips met hers softly, tentatively, a question and an answer all at once. Eliza had been kissed before, clumsy encounters with boys her own age that had left her wondering what all the fuss was about. This was different. This was heat and sweetness, and a connection that went deeper than just physical attraction. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "Court you properly, give you time to be sure." "I'm already sure," Eliza said, but she understood what he meant. They were defying enough conventions as it was. They could at least try to maintain some semblance of propriety. "I'm still moving slow," Dalton insisted. "You deserve that, deserve to be treated with respect." "You've never treated me with anything but respect," Eliza pointed out. "Then I'll continue that tradition," he said with a small smile, "starting with walking you back to your room like a proper gentleman." They did just that, walking slowly across the yard under a sky full of stars, their hands clasped between them. At the foot of the stairs to her room, Dalton kissed her again, longer this time, deeper, a promise of things to come. "Good night, Eliza," he said, his voice rough with the effort of letting her go. "Good night, Dalton," she replied, then climbed the stairs on shaking legs, her heart full to bursting. In her room, she stood at the window and watched as he walked back to the main house, his stride confident even in the darkness. She was in love, truly in love for the first time in her life, and it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The next morning, things were both the same and completely different. They still had their routines, their work to do, but now there were lingering glances across the breakfast table, hands brushing as they passed each other in the kitchen, moments of connection that made Eliza's heart race. Dalton was true to his word about courting her properly. He brought her flowers from the wild desert blooms, took her on rides around the property to show her his favorite places, talked with her about his dreams for the ranch, and listened with genuine interest when she shared her own hopes for the future. He was teaching her about the cattle operation too, showing her how to read brands, how to assess the health of the herd, how to manage the business side of ranching that was just as important as the physical work. Eliza absorbed it all eagerly, her quick mind grasping concepts that Dalton said had taken him years to fully understand. "You're a natural at this," he told her one afternoon as they sat on horseback overlooking a section of grazing land. "Better than I was when I started." "I had a better teacher," Eliza replied, and the pleasure in his smile made her glad she'd said it. They went to town again in late October, and this time the gossip was more pointed. Eliza heard the whispers as they walked through the general store, saw the disapproving looks from some of the townswomen. But Dalton held his head high, kept his hand at the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive, and made it clear through his demeanor that he didn't care what anyone thought. "Does it bother you?" Eliza asked as they drove back to the ranch. "What they say?" "Only because it bothers you," Dalton replied. "Otherwise, no. I know the truth of what we are to each other, and that's all that matters." "What are we to each other?" Eliza asked, realizing they'd never actually defined it. Dalton pulled the wagon to a stop, right there in the middle of the road, and turned to face her. "You're the woman I love," he said simply. "The woman I intend to marry if she'll have me. The woman I want to spend the rest of my life building something beautiful with." "That sounds like a proposal," Eliza said, her heart hammering. "It's a promise," Dalton corrected. "The proposal will come later when I've got a ring and have done it properly. But I wanted you to know where my heart is, where it's been since almost the moment we met." Eliza leaned across the wagon seat and kissed him, not caring that they were in the open where anyone could see. "My heart is in the same place," she said against his lips. "Has been for longer than I wanted to admit." November brought cooler weather and a change in the ranch work. It was time for a partial roundup, gathering some of the cattle to sell before winter made travel more difficult. Dalton hired 2-day laborers from town to help with the work, and Eliza found herself managing the logistics, preparing meals for the extra workers, keeping track of the business details that Dalton didn't have time for while he was in the field. It was exhausting work, dawn to well past dusk, but Eliza thrived on it. She felt useful in a way she never had before, integral to the operation rather than just someone who cooked and cleaned. And she saw the respect in Dalton's eyes when he came in each night, saw how much he valued her contribution. The sale went well, better than expected, and Dalton was able to pay off some debts and put money aside for winter feed. That evening, after the laborers had been paid and sent home, he and Eliza sat together on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set in shades of orange and purple. "I couldn't have done this without you," Dalton said, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. Not just the logistics, but having you here, knowing I had someone who believed in what I was trying to do, that made all the difference. We're partners, Eliza said. That's what partners do, they support each other. Is that what we are, partners? Dalton asked, and there was something in his voice that made Eliza look up at him. I thought so. Isn't that what you offered me that night in the kitchen? It is, Dalton agreed. But I'm hoping we're more than that now. I'm hoping we're building towards something permanent. Eliza's breath caught. They'd been courting for almost 2 months now, but she'd assumed Dalton would want more time, would want to be absolutely certain before making any formal commitments. Are you saying what I think you're saying? She asked carefully. Dalton shifted, and to Eliza's shock, he slid off the porch step they were sitting on and onto one knee in front of her. From his pocket, he pulled out a simple gold band with a small but perfect diamond catching the last rays of sunlight. I had this made last time I was in town, he said. Been carrying it with me for weeks, waiting for the right moment. And I realized today, watching you manage everything so competently, seeing how perfectly you fit into this life, that there would never be a more right moment than this. Dalton, Eliza breathed, tears already forming in her eyes. Eliza Dawson, you came into my life as a trespasser, and somehow you ended up with ownership of my soul. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to build this ranch with you, raise children with you, grow old with you. Will you marry me? There was no hesitation, no doubt, no fear, just joy so pure it felt like it might consume her. Yes, Eliza said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, of course, yes. Dalton slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her specifically. Then he was standing and pulling her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her dizzy, made her forget everything except the feel of him against her, and the knowledge that this man, this good, honest, hard-working man, loved her enough to give her his name and his life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton said, I don't want a long engagement. I want you as my wife, sharing my home, my bed, my life. Is that too fast? It's perfect, Eliza assured him. I don't need a big wedding or months of planning. I just need you and a preacher and the legal right to call you my husband. 2 weeks, Dalton said decisively. We'll go to town, get the license, have the preacher marry us. Then you're moving into the house with me where you belong. 2 weeks, Eliza agreed and sealed it with another kiss. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Eliza had no family to invite, and Dalton had only distant cousins he rarely saw, so they decided to keep the wedding small and simple. Eliza sewed herself a new dress from fabric Dalton bought on a special trip to town, pale blue that brought out her eyes. Dalton had his one good suit cleaned and pressed. The gossip in town reached a fever pitch when word got out about their engagement. Some people were scandalized, claiming it was too fast, too improper. Others were more understanding, recognizing that love didn't follow a convenient timeline and that 2 adults had the right to make their own choices. George at the general store was one of the scandalized ones. When they came in to buy supplies for the wedding celebration they were planning, just the 2 of them and maybe a few neighbors, he made his disapproval clear. This is all moving mighty fast, he said, his tone dripping with judgment. Some might say suspiciously fast. Dalton's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Eliza spoke up. If you're implying what I think you're implying, you can rest easy. Dalton has been nothing but a gentleman. We're marrying because we love each other and want to build a life together. If that's too fast for your liking, that's your problem, not ours. George backed off, muttering under his breath, and several other customers who'd been listening applauded Eliza's defense. One older woman even came up to her afterward and said, Good for you, standing up for yourself and your man. Don't let these old biddies tell you how to live your life. In the wagon on the way home, Dalton said, "You didn't have to do that, defend us like that." "Yes, I did," Eliza replied, "because we're not doing anything wrong. We're two adults who found each other and fell in love. The fact that it happened quickly doesn't make it any less real or valid." Dalton reached over and took her hand, bringing it to his lips for a kiss that lingered. "Have I told you today that I love you? Not since this morning," Eliza said with a smile. "Then I'm remiss. I love you, Eliza. More than yesterday, less than tomorrow." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the sky that particular shade of blue that only happened in Arizona in late November. They rode to town together in the wagon, Eliza in her blue dress with wildflowers in her hair, Dalton in his suit looking handsome enough to make her heart stutter. The preacher was waiting for them at the small church, along with a handful of townspeople who'd come out of curiosity or genuine goodwill. George wasn't among them, but the kind older woman from the general store was there, along with a few of the neighboring ranchers who'd worked with Dalton over the years. The ceremony itself was simple and brief. They spoke their vows in voices that were steady despite the emotion behind them. Dalton's hands trembled slightly as he placed a second ring on Eliza's finger, a matching gold band to go with the engagement ring. Eliza didn't have a ring for him, but he told her it didn't matter, that wearing hers was enough symbol of their union. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher said with a smile. "You may kiss your bride." Dalton did, sweetly and thoroughly, and the small congregation applauded. They signed the marriage certificate with witnesses present, making it legal and binding. Eliza Dawson became Eliza Quinn, and with that change of name, she felt something settle deep in her soul, a sense of rightness and belonging that she'd been missing her entire life. They had a small celebration at the church, cake that the preacher's wife had made and coffee and congratulations from the people who'd come. Then they climbed back into the wagon and headed home, husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word. The ranch looked different to Eliza as they approached it, though nothing had physically changed. It was hers now, legally and emotionally, a place where she belonged not as an employee or a guest, but as an equal owner with the man she loved. Dalton pulled the wagon up in front of the main house, their house now, and turned to her with an expression of such tenderness that Eliza felt her eyes fill with tears. "Welcome home, Mrs. Quinn," he said softly. "It feels like home," Eliza replied. "It has for a while now, but this makes it official." Dalton climbed down and came around to her side, but instead of helping her down normally, he swept her up into his arms, making her laugh with surprise. "What are you doing, carrying my bride over the threshold?" Dalton said with a grin. "It's tradition." He carried her into the house and set her down gently in the parlor, the room that had been closed and dusty when she'd first arrived but now gleamed with her care. Then he kissed her again, different from before, deeper and more urgent, a promise of the night to come. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes to me." "I could never regret this," Eliza assured him. "This is the best decision I've ever made." They spent the afternoon and evening together, talking and laughing and learning each other in new ways now that they were married. When night fell properly, Dalton led her to his bedroom, their bedroom now, and made love to her with a reverence and passion that brought tears to her eyes. It was her first time, and Dalton was gentle, patient, making sure she felt safe and cherished every moment. There was fumbling and nervousness, but there was also joy and connection, and the overwhelming rightness of two people who belonged together finally becoming one. Afterward, lying in Dalton's arms with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow, Eliza felt peace settle over her like a blanket. This was where she was meant to be. This was home. "Thank you," Dalton murmured, his hand stroking through her hair. "For what?" "For trespassing on my property that morning. For being brave enough to tell me the truth. For giving me a chance even though you had every reason to be afraid. For loving me back." Eliza propped herself up on one elbow so she could look at him. "I'm the one who should be thanking you. You saved me, gave me a home and work and a reason to hope again. And then you gave me so much more than that." "We saved each other," Dalton said, pulling her back down against him. "That's what partners do." Winter settled over the ranch, bringing cold nights and the occasional snow that dusted the red rocks with white. The work continued, just as Dalton had said it would, animals needing care no matter the weather. But now Eliza worked alongside him when she could, learning the ranching business from the ground up, becoming a true partner in the operation. She was good at it, better than either of them had expected. She had a head for numbers that made managing the books easier, an eye for detail that caught problems before they became serious, and a way with the animals that suggested she'd been born to this life despite her city upbringing. In the evenings, they'd return to the house together, muddy and tired but content, and Eliza would prepare dinner while Dalton cleaned up. They'd eat together at the kitchen table, talking about the day's work and making plans for the future, then retire to bed where they'd hold each other, and sometimes make love and always fall asleep, tangled together. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership and love that grew stronger with each passing day. Christmas came, and though they had little money for presents, they exchanged small tokens of affection. Dalton gave Eliza a leather journal for keeping ranch records and personal thoughts, the cover tooled with a beautiful pattern he'd commissioned from a craftsman in town. Eliza gave Dalton a new hat to replace his worn one, and a scarf she'd knitted herself during the long winter evenings. They celebrated alone, just the two of them, with a special dinner and time together in front of the fire in the parlor. Dalton told her stories about Christmases when his parents were alive, and Eliza shared memories of her father, the good times before the sickness took him. They mourned together and then set aside their grief, focusing instead on the future they were building. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Eliza began to suspect something that both thrilled and terrified her. Her monthly courses, always regular, were late. She felt tired in a way that wasn't explained by hard work, and certain smells that had never bothered her before made her nauseous. She waited to be sure, not wanting to get Dalton's hopes up if she was wrong. But when she missed her courses for the second month in a row, she knew it was time to tell him. She chose an evening in early March when the weather was warming and new life was visible everywhere on the ranch. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky when she gathered her courage. "Dalton, I need to tell you something." He turned to her immediately, always attentive when she had that tone in her voice. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," Eliza said simply. "We're going to have a baby." The expression on Dalton's face went through several transformations in rapid succession. Shock, then joy, then awe, then a tenderness so profound it made Eliza's throat tight. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hand reaching out to cover her still flat stomach with a touch that was gentle and reverent. "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor," Eliza confirmed. "I wanted to wait until I was certain before telling you." Dalton pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break. "I'm going to be a father," he said, wonder in his voice. "We're going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Eliza asked, needing to hear it even though she could see the joy radiating from him. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Dalton said. I'm overwhelmed and terrified and more excited than I've ever been. You're giving me a family, Eliza. A real family. They sat there until long after dark, talking about the future, about names and plans, and how they'd manage the ranch with a baby to care for. Dalton was already thinking practically about safety measures they'd need to implement, while Eliza was mentally calculating when the baby would arrive and what they'd need to prepare. The next time they went to town, they visited the doctor to confirm what Eliza already knew. Dr. Mitchell, who'd been an eager for decades and had delivered half the children in town, examined her and confirmed that yes, she was pregnant, probably about 3 months along. The baby would arrive in late September or early October. You're healthy and everything looks good, doctor, Mitchell told them. Just take care of yourself, don't overdo the physical work, and come see me once a month so I can monitor your progress. As her pregnancy progressed, Eliza found herself having to make adjustments to how much ranch work she could physically handle. It frustrated her at first, this forced acknowledgement of her limitations, but Dalton was patient and supportive, taking on extra work himself without complaint. He'd also hired a young man from town, Robert something, to help with the day-to-day labor. Robert was 18, eager to learn, and desperate for steady work. He proved to be reliable and hardworking, and Eliza was grateful for his presence as she found herself tiring more easily. The garden flourished under Eliza's continued care, providing vegetables that helped stretch their food budget. The cattle operation continued to grow, slowly but steadily, as Dalton's careful management and Eliza's business acumen combined to make the ranch more profitable than it had been in years. Summer arrived, bringing intense heat that made Eliza's pregnancy more uncomfortable. Dalton worried constantly, bringing her water, insisting she rest in the cool of the house during the hottest parts of the day, checking on her multiple times when he was working outside. I'm pregnant, not dying, Eliza told him one afternoon when he'd interrupted her cooking for the 3rd time to make sure she was all right. I know, Dalton said, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. I just don't want anything to happen to you or the baby. Eliza softened, going to him and wrapping her arms around him as much as her growing belly would allow. We're fine. I'm being careful, I promise, but I also need to feel useful. You have to let me do that. I know, Dalton repeated. I'm trying. It's just hard when you're carrying the most precious thing in the world. As her due date approached, Eliza found herself both excited and terrified. She'd helped with births before, assisted neighbors and friends, but it was different when it was your own body, your own child. Dalton was even more nervous, despite trying to hide it for her sake. They'd prepared a room for the baby, the smallest bedroom converted into a nursery with a cradle Dalton had built himself. Eliza had sewn clothes and blankets, preparing as much as possible for the new life that would soon join them. In late September, as the oppressive summer heat began to break, Eliza woke in the middle of the night with a pain low in her back that she immediately recognized. Her water broke an hour later, and Dalton rode like the devil himself was chasing him to fetch Dr. Mitchell from town. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the next day. Dr. Mitchell stayed with her the entire time, calm and reassuring even when Eliza was sure she couldn't take another moment of pain. Dalton held her hand, wiped her forehead, whispered encouragement even though his face was pale with worry. Finally, as the sun was setting, their son was born, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at being forced from his comfortable home. Dr. Mitchell cleaned him up and placed him in Eliza's arms, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt her heart expand in a way she hadn't known was possible. "He's beautiful," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Dalton was beside her, staring at their son with an expression of absolute wonder. "He's perfect. You're perfect. I can't believe we made this." They named him David after Dalton's father, with the middle name of Elliot after Eliza's. David Elliot Quinn, their son, the physical manifestation of their love and the future they were building together. The first few weeks with a newborn were harder than Eliza had anticipated. David was a good baby, but he needed constant care, and between the lack of sleep and recovering from childbirth, Eliza felt wrung out in a way she'd never experienced. But every time she looked at her son, every time Dalton held him with such tenderness, she knew it was worth every moment of difficulty. Dalton proved to be a natural father, taking to it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. He'd get up with David in the middle of the night so Eliza could sleep, would walk the floor with him when he was fussy, would just sit and watch him sleep with an expression of such love that it made Eliza fall in love with her husband all over again. Robert, the hired hand, proved invaluable during this time, taking on more responsibility so Dalton could spend time with his new family. They increased his wages and gave him more autonomy, and he responded by working even harder, clearly grateful for the opportunity. As autumn progressed into winter, life settled into a new rhythm that incorporated their son. Eliza learned to manage the household with a baby, became adept at accomplishing tasks one-handed while holding David, figured out how to balance being a mother with being a rancher's wife and business partner. David grew and thrived, hitting all the milestones Dr. Mitchell said he should. He had Dalton's green eyes and Eliza's dark hair, and his personality was already showing itself to be curious and determined. By the time he was 6 months old, he was trying to crawl, eager to explore the world around him. They celebrated David's first Christmas with joy, giving him simple toys that Dalton had carved from wood. David was more interested in the wrapping paper than the gifts, which made them both laugh. They took a photograph in town, the three of them dressed in their best clothes, capturing this moment of happiness to preserve forever. As David grew into a toddler, he became fascinated with the ranch, wanting to follow Dalton everywhere. Dalton was patient with him, letting him help with simple tasks, teaching him about the animals and the land with a gentleness that made Eliza's heart melt. Life wasn't always easy. There were hard seasons when money was tight, times when illness swept through the herd or drought threatened their water supply. But they faced each challenge together, drawing strength from each other and from the family they'd built. When David was 3, Eliza discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was easier, familiar, though no less miraculous. Their daughter, Anna Rose, was born in the spring, arriving quickly and easily compared to her brother's long labor. She had Dalton's green eyes like her brother, but her features were pure Eliza, delicate and pretty even as an infant. David was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to be involved in everything from feeding to diaper changes. Dalton had to carefully explain which things were helping and which weren't, but David's enthusiasm never waned. The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management. They expanded their herd, bought additional land from a neighbor who was retiring, and built a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Eliza's business sense and Dalton's ranching knowledge proved to be a perfect combination, and they were able to hire additional hands to help with the increased work. Robert, who'd been with them for years now, had become like family. He'd married a girl from town and built a small house on the edge of their property, staying on as foreman and Dalton's right-hand man. His loyalty and hard work had been instrumental in their success. The years passed in a blur of seasons, of children growing, of work and love and building something lasting. David grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Anna was bright and curious, always asking questions and exploring every corner of their property. When David was 8 and Anna 5, Eliza found herself pregnant once more, a surprise but a welcome one. This time they had a second son, James, who arrived with Dalton's temperament, easy-going and quick to smile. The house that had once felt too large for just Dalton now burst with life and energy. Children's laughter filled rooms that had been silent for too long. The ranch that Dalton had struggled to maintain alone now thrived with the help of his family and loyal employees. One evening, when James was about 2 years old, Eliza and Dalton found themselves alone on the porch, a rare moment of quiet with all 3 children asleep inside. They sat together as they had so many times before, watching the sun set over the land they'd built their life on. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Dalton asked, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest in their familiar position. "What morning?" Eliza asked, though she knew. "The morning I caught you trespassing. When you dropped to the ground because you heard my rifle, certain I was going to shoot you or have you arrested." Eliza smiled. "I think about it all the time. How terrified I was, how desperate, how sure I was that I'd reached the end of any hope for a better life." "I was so angry that morning," Dalton admitted. "Not at you specifically, just at the world, at the responsibility of keeping this place running alone, at the loneliness I wouldn't admit I felt. And then there you were, this woman who should have been terrified into silence but instead told me the truth with your chin up and fire in your eyes. I fell in love with you that day," Eliza confessed. "Not all at once, but the beginning of it. You were so fierce and protective of what was yours, but you still carried me to the house when you saw I needed help. You fed me and gave me work and treated me like I was worth something when I felt worthless. You gave me ownership of your ranch," Dalton said, a callback to something he'd told her years ago. "But you had ownership of my soul from almost the first moment." "We gave each other everything," Eliza corrected. "That's what love is supposed to be, isn't it? 2 people giving each other the best parts of themselves and building something beautiful from it." "It is," Dalton agreed. "And what we've built is more beautiful than I ever imagined possible." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Inside the house, they heard one of the children cry out briefly, then settle back into sleep. It was the sound of home, of family, of everything they'd worked so hard to create. "I want you to know," Dalton said eventually, "that every day with you has been a gift. Every morning I wake up next to you, every meal we share, every challenge we face together, I'm grateful. You took a lonely rancher who was barely holding on and gave him a reason to thrive instead of just survive. You did the same for me," Eliza said, lifting her head to look at him. "I was lost and afraid, and certain I'd never find a place to belong. And then you appeared with your green eyes and your gruff kindness and gave me not just a home but a family, a purpose, a future worth living." Dalton kissed her, sweet and familiar, the kiss of 2 people who'd shared years of their lives and planned to share many more. "I love you, Eliza Quinn, more than the day I married you, more than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "I love you too," Eliza replied. "Always have, always will." They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, holding each other and counting their blessings. 3 healthy children sleeping inside. A ranch that prospered through their combined efforts. Loyal employees who'd become friends. Neighbors who respected them despite the scandalous way their relationship had begun. A community that had eventually accepted them, recognizing that love didn't follow conventional timelines or rules, But most importantly, they had each other. The cowboy and the trespasser, who'd found in each other exactly what they needed to become more than they'd ever been alone. Years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also joy and growth. David grew into a young man who loved the ranch and showed every sign of taking it over someday. Anna proved to have a head for business even better than her mother's, already helping with the books and planning by the time she was 12. James was the heart of their family, always ready with a smile or a joke to lighten the mood. Dalton's hair gained gray at the temples, and lines deepened around his eyes. But he was still strong and capable, still the man Eliza had fallen in love with. Eliza herself had laugh lines and hands roughened from work, but she'd never been happier, never felt more fulfilled. They expanded the ranch further, buying more land and diversifying into horses as well as cattle. David showed a gift for training horses, and they began breeding and selling quality stock that brought buyers from across the territory. When Arizona became a state in 1912, they celebrated along with the rest of the territory, proud to be part of this new chapter in history. Their children were growing up in a different world than either Dalton or Eliza had known, with more opportunities and more stability. David married at 22, bringing a sweet girl named Margaret to the family. They built a house on the far side of the ranch property, and David took over more and more of the daily operations, allowing Dalton to finally slow down a bit. Anna, at 19, showed no signs of settling down, too focused on her business ventures and her plans to expand the ranch's reach. Eliza supported her fully, recognizing in her daughter the same drive and determination she'd had at that age. James, always the free spirit, talked about seeing more of the country before settling down, and while it worried his parents, they understood his need to find his own path. Through it all, Dalton and Eliza remained each other's constants. They still had their evening routine of sitting on the porch together, watching sunsets and talking about their day. They still shared a bed every night, still reached for each other in the darkness, still found comfort and passion in each other's arms after all these years. One evening, when Dalton was in his 50s and Eliza in her late 40s, they sat on their porch as they had countless times before. Their bodies were older, marked by years of hard work and the passage of time, but their love had only deepened, matured into something solid and unshakable. "Do you have any regrets?" Eliza asked, a question that had never occurred to her to ask before. "Not a single one," Dalton replied immediately. Only that I didn't trespass on your property sooner," Eliza said with a smile. "Think of all the extra time we could have had together." Dalton laughed, the sound rich and warm in the desert evening. "I think we met exactly when we were supposed to. Any earlier and we might not have been ready for each other. Any later and I'm not sure I would have survived the loneliness." "We saved each other," Eliza said, repeating words that had become a truth between them. "We did," Dalton agreed. "And then we built something beautiful." They looked out over the ranch, seeing it with the eyes of people who'd poured their lives into this land. The main house was larger now, expanded to accommodate their growing family. The barn had been rebuilt and improved. Fences stretched in neat lines across well-managed pastures. Cattle and horses grazed peacefully in the distance. But more than the physical improvements, they'd built a legacy. Children who were confident and capable, who knew how to work hard and love deeply. A ranch that would continue on for generations, providing for their family and employing others from the community. A love story that had started with a trespasser and a lonely rancher and had grown into something extraordinary. "Thank you," Eliza said softly. "For what?" Dalton asked, the same question he'd asked that first night they'd confessed their feelings. "For everything," Eliza said. "For not shooting me when you caught me trespassing, for feeding me when I was hungry, for giving me work and then giving me your heart, for being the best husband, the best father, the best partner I could have ever hoped for. The pleasure has been entirely mine," Dalton said, pulling her closer. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Eliza Quinn, the absolute best thing." They kissed, tender and sweet, a reaffirmation of vows spoken decades ago and lived out every day since. As the stars came out and the desert night settled around them, they sat together on the porch of the home they'd built, surrounded by the life they'd created, and counted themselves blessed beyond measure. The cowboy had caught a trespasser on his property all those years ago, but what he'd really found was his soulmate, his partner, his everything. And the trespasser, desperate and afraid, had found not just shelter but a home, not just work but a purpose, not just security but love that would last a lifetime. Their story, which had begun with fear and suspicion, had transformed into something beautiful. A testament to the power of honesty, hard work, and two people willing to take a chance on each other despite all the reasons they shouldn't. They'd built not just a successful ranch but a family, a legacy, and a love that would endure long after they were gone, passed down through their children and their children's children. As they finally rose from the porch and headed inside, Dalton's hand in Eliza's as it had been for over 30 years, they carried with them the satisfaction of a life well lived. They'd faced challenges and overcome them. They'd known heartache and joy in equal measure. They'd worked until their bodies ached and loved until their hearts were full. And through it all, from that first morning when a frightened woman trespassing on his land had looked up at him with defiant eyes, they'd known that they were exactly where they were meant to be, with exactly who they were meant to be with. The cowboy and his trespasser, who'd given each other ownership of their souls and built a life more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. Their love story had a happy ending because they'd worked for it, fought for it, chosen each other every single day. And in the end, that was what mattered most, not how their story began, but how they'd lived it together, building something that would last long after they were gone. A ranch, a family, and a love that proved that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected beginnings.